Oh, thank you so much. I'm really thrilled by this invitation. It's really kind of you.
Oh, of course, you're very, very welcome. Let me just give you a quick warning. So you will be audible to the room at large now.
Great.
I'm sorry you'll only be able to see me. I'll stay on camera so you've got at least something as a reaction, but we have a room full of people. We're very excited to hear you speak.
Yeah.
Are you good to go? Do you need anything from us?
I am. I'm ready whenever you are.
Perfect. I'm going to give you an introduction in just a moment, and then I'll hand it over. All right. Looks like we're all set up. Good. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our final session for the day. You've had fantastic stamina today. It's been a really wonderful first day. So thank you for all of your energy, your contributions, and your understanding with our technical difficulties and being unable to run to time. We've done the best that we can. So I am so delighted to be introducing Professor Karen Bradshaw, who is our second keynote panelist, or panel for today, as we had multiple panelists this morning. Karen is going to be speaking to us about her wonderful book and set of ideas around wildlife as property owners, and this being a new conception of animal rights. Karen Bradshaw is a professor of law at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law, Arizona State University. She is a senior sustainability scientist at the Global Institute of Sustainability and a faculty fellow at the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics. She is a prominent national media outlets, including Forbes, Fortune, The Atlantic, and the New York Times have featured Bradshaw's research. Karen Bradshaw is the author of several books, including the forthcoming Rights of Nature, Creating Interspecies Equity, Depolarized, How Stakeholder Collaborations Are Breaking Gridlock, and the internationally acclaimed book, Wildlife as Property Owners, A New Conception of Animal Rights, which we will be hearing about today. Wildlife as Property Owners was featured in the official 2022 Grammy gift bags and was highly recommended in a Forbes book review. So we have a real international superstar here with us for our final keynote for today. And Karen, I will hand over to you for your presentation.
Ian, thank you so much. And I can't thank you enough for inviting me, working with you and Paula and Michelle to virtually attend this event has been wonderful. I have to say my only regret, and it's a real one, is not being there in person, because I took a look at your panels and speakers and the people who are in attendance, and frankly, I want to meet you all. So hopefully we have the opportunity to do that at another time in the future. But for today, I am here in the very, very warm Phoenix, Arizona, and delighted to be joining you. So thank you for having me. In the interest of time, and because I know what it is to be at the end of the day and the conference program, I might keep my remarks just a bit shorter, and we can use that for question and answer, however we want to go. But I am sensitive to the needs of people who might want dinner or otherwise move on with their day. So I'll keep things a bit short. As Ian mentioned, I'll be talking today about my book, Wildlife as Property Owners, A New Conception of Animal Rights. And this is a book that attempts to address the biodiversity crisis by tracing the cause of many, not all obviously, but many wildlife deaths to property, systems, institutions of property, how humans hold and own land and natural resources in ways that categorically exclude the rights of all other non-human animals. And it's particularly interesting to me and enjoyable to me, this is part of what I'm looking forward to about today's conversation, to do this with a group in the UK. Much of the US, although not all of it, is run under English common law, so rules that were developed in Ireland, Scotland, England, continue to affect the North American landscape today. And much of my current research, which has proceeded after the book, looks at the way that the historic development of systems of property affect contemporary notions of interspecies equity, both positively and negatively for those of us who care about animals. So having established that biodiversity is a crisis and that property is a problem, the final part of my speech, and where I'll probably spend the most time, is talking about radically reimagining our contemporary institutions to create a better human relationship with nature. And I'm so excited to share not only the ideas in the book, which really now seem a bit tentative, but the amazing thing that people around the world are doing, including most notably the UK, to actualize these ideas. And it foregrounds forthcoming books that I have about rights of nature, political depolarization, and transdisciplinary efforts for local stakeholders to work in their daily lives in ways that reshape our relationship with the natural world. So that's it in a nutshell. Everything I'm going to say, I have now said, but those are the three parts of the talk: biodiversity crisis, property is a problem, radically reimagining the future. But to get there, I have to say I always start with a story, because I think stories are an incredibly powerful way to connect us to where we are. So if you can settle in for a moment in the crowd, if you don't mind, if you could take a breath and maybe close your eyes if you're willing to, I'm going to invite you into my landscape. I would like us to create a shared experience, even with technology and Zoom. I think it's important to relate to the fact that we are animals living in biophysical reality. So increasingly, I invite people in conversations that I'm part of to take a moment and connect to your animal bodies individually, and to collectively join me in an experience of connecting to the landscape that inspired the book that I wrote. So if I could ask you, and I know this seems a bit hard by Zoom, but I promise it's really an invitation, and I hope you take it seriously, to close your eyes for a moment, and I'll talk you through the places that influence the development of this book. I'm sitting right now in Phoenix, Arizona. It's a Sonoran desert landscape. And the book began in Northern California. So close your eyes if you can and imagine the redwoods towering above the Pacific Ocean, and the Klamath River, which has held salmon for hundreds of years, cascading down through the redwood forest and into the Pacific Ocean. Then in your mind for a moment, please go east, and we're in Mount Shasta, California. This is where I spent the second half of my childhood, with the towering Mount Shasta, 14,000 feet, towering over a ponderosa pine landscape, with waterfalls, upper, middle, lower, cascading through the McCloud River, where salmon once ran, but no longer did. And then we'll go south to where I'm sitting today, which is the Sonoran Desert, home of saguaro cactuses that take 100 years to grow their first iconic arm. My home landscape, the property on which I sit, is rewilded land that I've owned for 11 years. And when I say owned, I mean shared with my neighbors, the javelina, the roadrunner, the bobcat. And now if we can go west for just a moment, we can return to that Northern California coastline. We can think of the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, the oceans that connect all of us with the creatures that live in them, the landscape, the borders, the boundaries, the walkways that are affected by the legal systems that we'll talk about today. Okay, so take a moment to open your eyes, reconnect to the breath in your body, and think about the fact that each of us are shaped by place. I truly believe that places make us who we are, which is why I began my work by describing the Klamath and McCloud rivers that shaped my childhood and my early experiences. These rivers, like many places in the world, are suffering from biodiversity crises and problems at the hands of human exploitation today. I know in this group, there is no need to drone on about the statistics or the stories of biodiversity loss, but I'll suffice it to say that this is a leading crisis that many people are thinking may eclipse, although it's not a zero-sum game, they're of course intertwined, the climate crisis. We are increasingly aware, and Elizabeth Kolbert's work helped bring to the masses the idea that we're on the edge of a sixth extinction. We are decimating systems of interspecies relationships that we don't even understand, interfering in ecological webs than which our very survival requires consistent maintenance and preservation, and instead we're devastating individual species without cognizance of the way in which their interrelationships affect our own survival. So thinking about the biodiversity crisis, which I have for a long time, leads to the question of what is the cause? The reason being, what is the solution? Now, the solution and cause have been hammered out by other scholars. Most notably, E.O. Wilson had the influential book Heifer that essentially said that from a scientific perspective, the key to ending the biodiversity crisis was really about habitat. Habitat loss drives biodiversity loss. So, E.O. Wilson suggested we need to just set aside half of the earth for more than human world, animals, plants, etc. Although I think E.O. Wilson is an incredible person who did a really important job explaining to the general public both the problem but also the solution, he didn't tell us how to do this. And of course, although we can know scientific right answers, if we have learned anything, particularly in the United States with response to the climate crisis, we understand that having the right answers scientifically does not always result in public policies facilitating change. So the purpose of my work is to understand if the solution is to dramatically reshape our consumptive patterns of Earth, to rethink the human relationship with nature, how might we do so within our existing legal systems? And I'll flag here that many people say, why do you accept as given property? Why do you accept as given existing legal systems? Is overthrow not the better answer? And my response is, I'm a pragmatist in a state of emergency. In my mind, doing what we can now for as many creatures is the most important thing. And I think many people have different perspectives, different ways of approaching the problem. And as a yogi, I believe in the yes and approach, meaning yes, it is important to rethink our systems. Yes, it is important to rethink systems of property. And it is also important to do what we can today in the institutions in which we find ourselves, in the systems in which we have been inherited. And that's really what my work focuses on. And I essentially argue that animals should be included in the category of those who can own. So the way that I landed on this idea is actually a bit funny, and it's related to the place where we started at the Sonoran landscape. I lived in Manhattan, I was from California, and I got my first teaching gig in Arizona 10 years ago, 11 years ago. And I thought, how on earth can I relate these concepts that I learned in Chicago and New York and California, these very different landscapes, to students in the Sonoran Desert? What are the stories I can tell here? I'm one of 2 environmental law professors in the entire state. Phoenix is the 5th biggest city in the United States, and so it's really a large area, but there's relatively little environmental law scholarship compared to places like Ohio, which has 11 law schools. So I really had to develop my own material because there's a relative dearth of information. So I began teaching students about a local controversy involving jaguars and the Rosemont copper mine, because I do believe that place is so important and that we need to connect to the places that we are. It's not enough to teach stories from a book elsewhere. We must relate them to our lives and experience to make the kinds of connection and change that I was hoping to bring into my students' lives. So after teaching about these jaguars, these beautiful spotted cats that historically lived in Arizona, then were forced into Mexico, and with the drug agriculture train in Mexico are now coming back across the border into Arizona, but are blocked by the border fence that's partially constructed. I was reading a book, maybe the only book, called The Borderland Jaguars, about jaguar behavior. And I remember like it was yesterday, I was reading the book in the summer, at night, as bedtime reading, and I began to read that the jaguars build mounds 4 to 5 feet tall at the corners of their property, the only purpose of which is to mark territory. And I just read that sentence again and again, and in my mind's eye, I saw a fence line in Costa Rica, where I visited for an ecological tour in the summer between law school courses. And the fence lines in Costa Rica are just vertical posts. There's no horizontal strips across them. And I could see the Costa Rican fence line. And then I saw, although I've never seen one in person, the jaguar mounds. I can imagine them. And I realized that the jaguars were essentially forming fences around their territory. They were creating visual markers, the only purpose of which, 4 to 5 feet tall, approximately my height, just a little shorter, was to mark their territory. And this began a series of investigations that unfolded over the course of years, looking into ethnography or the scientific behavior of animals, which revealed that animals engage in territorial behaviors which look a lot like property by any other name. In fact, I believe that property is just the human term for territoriality, and that it is something that is common among species, not just sophisticated or human-like species like apes or orcas, but ants and fish and lizards have these incredibly sophisticated mechanisms for nonviolent dispute resolution to adjudicate territorial claims. So instead of going to court, spiders bounce up and down on the web, and the vibrations of the web tell the spider who would win in the case of conflict, so they don't fight to the death. I'm sorry, National Geographic, but that happens very rarely among wildlife. The weaker spider simply goes away and leaves the disputed territorial area of the web to the other spider. Lizards have remarkable mechanisms of communication. We could call it language, where they use different tail wags to signal territorial claims. Dogs use scent to tell the territorial boundaries, the age of the marking, the strength of the claim, the health and nutrition of the other dog who might defend its claim. So much like a fancy fence could tell you that the property owner had the resources to defend their property boundary, the scent of a dog communicates a rich array of information about that territorial claim. So starting from that observation, which is chapter 3 in my book, I began to develop this hypothesis that animals had property right, territoriality systems within their own species for things like giving property over time. So back to the example of jaguars. Jaguars have a very sophisticated system of inheritance whereby the mother jaguar, the woman, the female jaguar, holds the property, and when she dies, it is equally divided among her female offspring, and the male offspring have to leave, which is why the male offspring are coming over the border into Arizona. So if we accept that animals have understandings of ownership, nonviolent dispute resolution, and boundary marking, that begs the question, why do we exclude them from human systems of property? Why do Western colonial systems assume that animals don't have the right to own? And I think it's important that I was raised in a system where I assumed that animals didn't own, like many other people did. But this is not necessarily the norm across the world, across cultures, or across time. Many different groups, including some, although not all, indigenous groups in the United States, Native Americans, believe that animals, nature, the more than human world, rivers, rock formations, plants, have co-equal rights to humans. And the interesting thing is that colonial systems and colonial courts couldn't comprehend a world in which the animals would own the land on which they live, so they didn't decimate those rights, they didn't extinguish them. And property rights are remarkably durable. They survive wars, they survive government transfers, individual private property that is remarkably respected in law. So if historic systems did not decimate the property rights of humans or of animals in the United States, it's quite possible that they could be restored and that they've never been lost and therefore don't have to be established. So in the next step of my research was thinking, well, are there places where animals have property? And this survey revealed that it's actually remarkably widespread. For example, in the last 10 years, most American states have enacted laws that allow animals to inherit in trust. So depending on the state, your dog or cat can inherit your home or your assets when you die. Some animals have inherited millions of dollars. Some pets have inherited millions of dollars. There are also a number of carve-outs for different wildlife species. The Pryor horses, which is a herd of horses in Montana, has 31,000 acres of land that Congress has dedicated to their, not quite exclusive use, but primary use. Their needs matter most. Golden eagles and bald eagles, the national bird of the United States, if they perch in your tree, that tree actually belongs to them now more than it belongs to you, and that you can't cut it down, you can't trim the branches. If they nest in that tree, the tree is essentially theirs as a matter of federal law. So we can find these little pockets of law, existing law, that say there are many ways in which animals could be co-participants in our system of property. And I think the purpose of this project is to think how far can we push that through systems of both private and public action to allow people, to enable people, to empower people to give land to animals. So this turns to the third point of my brief remarks today, and I'll wrap it up here, but there's a lot of really interesting things happening where individual people are using the talent and creativity that emerge from their particular life experiences and sense of place. For me, it's the Sonora Desert. For me, it's the McCloud River. For me, it's the Klamath River. But everyone has a place where they're from. And I am constantly inspired by the way that people around the world are using their individual stories and connection to place to reimagine the way that they relate to the natural world, just because we inherited a particular perspective in which wildlife is excluded from systems of law, government, and economics, including systems of property, but it's broader than that, doesn't mean that that has to be the legacy that we pass on to our children. And the remarkable creativity that has emerged in response to, in conversation with, this book and this idea of interspecies equity is constantly inspiring me. So a couple of small examples, some from the UK. I'll choose 3 from the UK. There's just an international explosion of creativity and examples. But Melanie Challenger, who spends, as I understand it, some of her time in London, although I'll be seeing her in New York next week, has the Animal in the Room initiative that imagines ways of relating to the natural world, whether it be through board meetings or government entities or interspecies mediation over disputes of land or territory. She's leading an international coalition of people who are rethinking our systems of relating to the human-animal relationship, or the way of relating to the animal world. Claire Hamlet, who is this incredible journalist in the United Kingdom that writes on animal issues, did a crowdfunded effort to save a local, I forgot what she called it, I forget the terminology, but it was something like a lumber lot or woodland lot, this special, very old, protected area of trees, with the idea that she might title the trees for themselves, this experimentation. The vegan land movement in the UK purchases land that is used for conventional agriculture and reimagines it as sanctuaries for livestock and farmed animals to live out their lives peacefully and without fear of death. So 3 examples in the United Kingdom. There are more around the world that I'm constantly learning about and constantly inspired by. But as my work unfolds, I think about reimagining the human relationship with nature as a multifaceted project in which every person on the planet, regardless of education, class, status, hierarchy, sort of dismantling these traditional notions, has an important role in playing on an individual and collective level. I'm thinking about depolarization, the way in which small stakeholder groups organized around a particular area, land, or resource can reshape the political tenor of an entire country, can take highly polarized people and places and give them a shared communal interest, much like Scottish land systems that have this communal element that were stripped out in colonialism in Scotland and then imported to the United States, so reintroducing community or communal imagining of land holdings. And then also thinking about the rights of like nature, this indigenous-led international movement. In the United States, my favorite articulation, the Klamath River, the place where I was born, a town of 700 people. It's the first river with legal personhood in the entire United States. So these efforts and experimentation is really, I think, the path forward. And I am so thankful to Ian and to Paula and to Michelle for their work and to bringing you together to continue to think about the ways that we can be better friends, partner, nature's coexistence with the other creatures on this planet. So with that, I will stop and be very open to questions.
Thank you so very much, Karen. That was a wonderful ending to our first day. Thank you for grounding us in the land that you come from that inspired your book. And thank you for using examples from the UK to help us ground ourselves in our environment here. That's very much appreciated. So we have a microphone that we're going to pass around the room, and I do hope you'll be able to hear these questions okay. Do let me know. If not, I will do my best to repeat them to you. So we will open to the floor for questions for Karen. Who would like to kick us off?
Good afternoon, Karen. I hope you can hear me. You mentioned one of the rivers, and where I live in North Yorkshire, we have something called the River Wharfe. And in the United Kingdom, one of the big problems is the water companies. I don't know if this is comparable to America, but one of the big issues right now is water pollution and human excrement being deposited into local rivers. We know water pollution is a real problem in this country and affects the diversity, and indeed with agriculture and other issues with land management. I'm just wondering if that's the same in America with the water systems and human wastage.
Absolutely, that's a great question. I think rivers are the veins through the body of the lands on which we live, and maintaining healthy waterways is an essential part of the body and the landscape. And rivers, for some reason, particularly this past year, I've been researching and doing some field work and talks in Australia and New Zealand, and then my rivers in California. Rivers seem to be having this incredible moment where people are understanding the role in which they play. And there's something, isn't there, about human excrement in the rivers that's metaphorical. It's not just the biodiversity aspects of how that might affect fish, aquatic species, and plants, or the pollutive aspects as how that might affect human health and the clean water. But it's almost a metaphor, right? It's almost a way in which we're polluting our systems with our very bodies. There's something very visceral about the way that that feels. So that is something that's happening. This morning, I have Alexa in my house, which is like a radio system that you can program to do different things. And in the morning, it turns on at 6:30 with the news. So I woke this morning to the story of these mussels that are invading species, or an invasive species that are going through river systems in the United States. And they are in the Columbia River Gorge, or approaching the Columbia River Gorge in Oregon. And so the solution, which the local radio station, it's National Public Radio, which is generally a very good news source in the United States, but they just said it as if it was a very normal thing, that they put this copper system into the Snake River to kill all the mussels. And I thought, what a way to wake up this morning, right? That we're putting these chemicals into our rivers to get one problem, and it's like we never learn about the ways in which our behaviors and actions create other problems, human health effects. They might kill other species. It's very hard to isolate just one mussel as a species. And so I think this idea of pollution and rivers and the ways in which we interact with rivers is very much top of mind. I'm also writing a dictionary entry for French Dictionary on Rights of Nature this morning. It's what I was doing earlier. And I was writing about the Klamath River and the legal personhood and the history of reshaping it with a series of 7 dams that changed its flow and blocked its fish migration. All of this is to say, yes, many issues, including human excrement, and pollution, are issues in waterways in the United States. And thinking about the rights of the river as an independent being, tied not only to indigenous conceptions, which are important and valuable and missing of the conversations, but also the right of the species of fish, which we have in California. The Delta smelt has rights to certain water, but also the right of the river to exist in its own way and to flourish is really interesting and important. So I think it's great that you mentioned this. It's great that you're thinking about it. And this is a place for incredible creativity, both legally and otherwise.
Thank you, Karen. Some really apt connections there. And if I can pick out one very quickly, Michelle, who you've spoken with, who you've all been getting to know today or reconnecting with, has been doing some work on the Wanganui River, doing a case study within her PhD on the rights of that river and how it's been treated throughout history. So I very much agree. It seems the river is having its cultural moment, and it's great to see so many different people working on this. So thank you for that. Can we come to the audience for another question for Karen? Yes.
Question. Sorry. Oh, sorry. Thanks. Hi, Karen. Lovely to be virtually introduced to you. You were talking before about your own area of land and having sort of rewilded it over the past 11 years. I've done a similar project in the area of Warwickshire where I live. It's taken about 15 years to see a real change in the landscape where I am. I now have peregrine falcons back. I was sitting down by my stretch of the River Avon, and an otter came up with a fish in its mouth. It was all very idyllic, but it has taken 15 years to regenerate it and to allow the nature to come back. Which leads me to my next question. I work for the All-Party Parliamentary Group on animal welfare, trying to influence policy and how we get lawmakers to really change. And the political landscape is so short-termist. I can see it's taken myself 10, 15 years to make a change. When the government's, you've got a big election coming up, we have a big election coming up. Every 5 years there is a change of politicians and everyone expects a quick fix. So what would your approach be to get the political landscape to see a longer term approach and to not see everything as, let's fix this in the next 5 years, and we're going to do this, and no one sticks around for 10 or 15 years to actually put in the hard miles?
I think that's a wonderful, wonderful point. Thank you for your work with the otter and the falcons. I think nature rewards us for paying mindful attention to the outdoors where we live, and it sounds like you're getting an increasing number of species in response to the effort and care that you're putting into your place in the world. And I think that that's actually the answer, right? I think this is a radical thing for an environmental law professor to say, but with the joys of tenure, I get to say it. So I think that politics matter much less than we give it credit for. I think the 24-hour news cycle is designed to make us feel, maybe not designed, has the effect of making us feel trapped and at the whim of political systems. And although they're very important and federal action obviously matters and it's important to do what we can, it is also important to take an eco-feminist perspective that rejects the ability of systems and institutions to shape and control the quality of our life, and to embrace, I think wholeheartedly, the joy that is living in right relation to our individual landscapes. And I think sparking joy in our hearts every day through time outside, sitting in the sun, having a bird feeder on your balcony, living in right relation to the companion animals that are members of our multi-species families is a radical act. And I encourage everyone to undertake radical acts in ways small and unusual and different and experimental and maybe weird to co-create new realities. What I find very often in my law school classes is that conventional mechanisms of teaching take what students care about and beat it out of them to make them into corporate lawyers. And I refuse to do that. I think that that is important, incredibly important, to teach the students the skills of our craft, to give them the tools that they need to read cases and understand how statutes are enacted and read the law and discern from a series of cases what the through line must be. Those are the practical tools. And then I say now the tools are in the hand of a different master, right? Tools didn't exist. They weren't given. People like me didn't have access, right? Some little girls from tiny towns didn't have access to legal tools historically, but I was able to gain an education and get access to those tools and hand them to my students, and they can use them in whatever creative and magical and interesting ways that they want to create radical, sweeping social change, right? And so I think part of what we have to do is empower ourselves to see past the next political cycle, which, I mean, let's be honest, is probably going to be terrible and could suck a lot of our energy and time and thought and power. Or we could go outside and we could see the falcon and we could see the otter, right? There's always the option to continue to play into the status quo. And then there's also the option to say, I think it's a radical act to teach law students that they're allowed to care about things and that maybe fairness matters, and that they are just receiving a system that was the best that past generations could do, but that was a very limited and exclusive group of people. And now that we have more diversity and we have women and people of traditionally marginalized groups empowered with the same set of tools, they might bring their legal experience or they might bring the legal expertise in conjunction with being from small towns, being from different places, growing up in the river, living in that kind of natural setting. So let's just blow our own minds about what is possible and what is achievable and get outside of this status quo of here is the system we're in and we have to be miserable because we're stuck in this way, and put all of our energy, time, and talent into co-creating new legal realities, a form of futurism. What could happen? What's the best that could happen? And engage in that. And the final point I'll make, and this is from my Klamath River research this morning, I was reading about someone who said his grandmother used to fight and hold signs and protest and travel to Sacramento, California and Washington, D.C. to protest the dams on the river. And in her lifetime, she never saw those dams removed. She never ate the upriver salmon that her family had. But her grandson, who watched her and went with her in her protest activities, watched those dams be removed and is seeing the salmon return to the river where they were historically excluded. And the cultural implications of that, I think, are such a lesson for us, because 11 years or 15 years seems like a long time, but when we situate it against someone who spent their entire life fighting an environmental injustice and now created that change for her grandchildren, I think we can be inspired that the efforts of what we do may not be realized today, but that doesn't mean that it's futile or wrong or limited to 5 years.
Amazing, thank you, Karen. I think "or we could go outside" is a really wonderful call to action and a multi-layered soundbite that I'll definitely take forward after today, so thank you for that.
Thank you.
Do we have more questions for Karen? Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for your very creative and thought-provoking ideas. I've got 2 questions, maybe more doctrinal questions. Would you extend your concept also to other natural elements apart from animals? And if so, how would you delineate these elements? For example, a river and the fish living in it. And the second question, if we allocate property rights to animals or other natural elements, would it also be possible to conclude contracts on the transfer of these property rights? Thank you.
Great questions, and I love the doctrinal elements, right? My inner property lawyer nerd loves thinking deeply about these questions, and luckily there's an ever-growing group of people with far more expertise than me, such as my trust lawyer, who's working through the thornier elements and the specific doctrinal elements with me, and has been for years. So I have better answers to these questions today than I did when I wrote the book. But the final chapter of the book says, is animal property rights or wildlife property rights really just rights of nature? And the answer is kind of yes, they're one form of rights of nature. People have very narrow conceptions of rights of nature as constitutional provision or legal personhood, but I think extending the category of who can own to include the more than human world is an example of the rights of nature. And I say in the book, my basis for extending property rights to animal, and there are several bases. One being, as I said earlier, the territoriality of animals extends very easily to all animals on the tree of rights. So this is one way. This is very different than the animal rights, animal welfare debate. Animal rights tend to focus on human-like creatures. I say ants, lizards, fish, and spiders have equal systems of property and are therefore entitled. So really, it's a very broad system of who can own among animals. And then to your question about rivers or plants, plants actually have systems of territoriality that are akin to animals. The only figure I wanted to include in the book, and it didn't make it, is this fascinating diagram of 2 root balls. So when we see plants on the surface of the land, we just see the plants growing, but underneath there are these incredible systems of roots. And if there's one plant in isolation, the root ball, the system of the roots, extends in a uniform, almost spherical pattern. But if there are 2 plants adjacent to one another within a certain distance, the plants develop essentially a fence between them, right? Where they don't grow their roots towards one another and they grow their roots out to the side, like this, to create different sort of territoriality among plants. So plant territoriality exists. I think it's a basis for extending property rights to plants. I think that's harder to do. And like the implementation questions of whether to entitle rights to the ecosystem, et cetera, is really complicated, but the answer is animals, yes, plants, yes. And then as I've gone deeper into this research, I've worked with a number of geologists, indigenous communities, and artists who work with rocks who have introduced me to the idea that rocks and landscapes are alive. It's just in geological time. So human brains can't quite comprehend them as living because the shifts happen so slowly. But by traditional and historic definitions of life, if extended over that landscape time frame, in fact, landscapes also are likely alive. I think anyone who's been in a river probably understands on some level viscerally that the river also has a certain livelihood to it. So I block my line at natural objects, naturally occurring things in the biophysical world. The really interesting place to me, and I've tentatively put forth this hypothesis here, I don't extend it to artificial intelligence. I don't extend it to human created robots or systems of intelligence that other people have built on my work to make that extension. And I think that's a very rich and interesting conversation I've not yet weighed in on because my interest thus far has been more in the natural world, but I envision it as the whole more than human world. Your second question, remind me, what was the second question?
The contracts, whether it's possible to conclude contracts.
Yes, the short answer is yes. In order to be a landowner, you have to be able to engage in anything else that any other landowner could, such as contracts, sale of land, alienation, etc. And the way in which we do that in the United States is a trust model. So just as children or people without the mental capacity to conduct their own affairs can have representatives with a fiduciary duty to them to manage their affairs, so too do I envision animals, etc., non-human landowners participating through the use of human trustees. And then the really interesting question, which is an incredible wildlife artist who I collaborate with, Lauren Strohacker, is working on, is how do we engage in those kinds of interspecies mediation? How do we know what the animal wants? Who gets to speak for the animal? And one of the benefits of being a law professor instead of a philosopher is I think we can speak for the animals. I think that our methods are imperfect, but I think that we're required and obligated to come up with them. It's not enough to say, well, I'm not a bat, so I don't know how bats think when you're a lawyer. I'm also not in a vegetative state, and yet I, as a lawyer and courts, can speak on behalf of people in vegetative states. We don't have the option to exclude as legally relevant parties who can't speak for themselves. So I think this is going to be a tremendous area of legal innovation. How can nature speak for itself, and who speaks for nature?
Nice. Really important questions. Thank you, Karen. I think we can push to one more question. Someone's got a burning one before we finish. Yes.
Hi there, Karen. I'm actually a student at the law student at the University of Idaho. So I don't know if you've heard about the law that Idaho, or the bill that Idaho recently passed that is intending to kill off 80 to 90% of our wolves in quite horrific ways. So I guess my question is, if animals are afforded property rights, how does that tie into the hunting of those animals?
Great question. The wolf situation in the United States is fascinating, interesting, horrifying, and at times inspiring, but it's always controversial. Wolves are in some ways the third rail of human interactions with the natural world, because in order to have livestock, you at a sort of sustainable, profitable commercial rate, wolf predation has always been necessary. So the question then is, should we have livestock? And in the Western United States, that's a fraught question. And the answer right now is yes, right? That is the way that historic and embedded interests are answering the question. But there are incredible efforts in the US and around the world to try to integrate more neatly the industry and the landscape and the animals and navigate those challenges. And I have to say, although I am obviously passionate about nature and animal rights, I am also very aware of the human costs that come from prioritizing animal interests at the cost of certain industries. My father is a forester. The town of 700 people was historically lumber. The spotted owl controversy had very real effects on the families in the community that I lived in. as people lost their jobs, right? And so I am sensitive and attuned to that. I think human lives matter, right, too. And I know that that can sometimes be controversial to say in communities of people who care about animals, and of course I very deeply do, but I think it's important to acknowledge these are not situations with easy outcomes because of embedded interests and individual lives. And so with wolves, one of the most compelling stories I've ever heard was Greg Dunnigan, the National Park Supervisor at Gates of the Arctic National Park, gave a tour of that to a variety of environmental law professors. And they had a community of wolves that they had sort of lovingly cultivated within the bounds of the national park. And the state of Alaska, the national park is federal, the state of Alaska sent up helicopters. And the moment the wolves, this pack that they had cultivated for decades, crossed the line from federal to state land, armed gunmen in the helicopters killed the entire pack of wolves to prevent them from eating the caribou, which are used for hunting purposes in Alaska. So I think one of the ways that I understand these kinds of conflicts, and something I very much hope becomes part of the normal conversation, is interspecies resource competition, where humans are competing with another specific animal species for the same thing, right? And it's not a perfect metric. I have a paper with Shally Fassmeyer in International Journal of Economists, which said, let's reduce these to triads. Of course, there are many complicated pieces, but just to begin to wrap our mind through these kinds of very difficult problems, let's create triads. So if we think about the wolves and the people, both want the resource of the landscape on which the livestock graze, we begin to understand that humans are in fact always engaging in resource competition with other species. Just as the barred owl and the spotted owl compete for the same species, the same resources, so too are humans in competition with other animals, right? And we use them for sustaining individual lives and for commercial and industrial purposes. But I love this way of taking our experience as humans and animals and actually leveling the playing field and saying we're seeking the same resource. And that opens the door to thinking about collaborative solutions, just like we do when we have two people who want the same resource and to have exclusive use over it, but have to find a way to share it, right? And so I think in the Idaho case, and that's a really interesting, disappointing, difficult case, any work that can be done to reframe it from this resource triad model opens the doors to new solutions making. And I'll say just one final thing. One of the exciting things that I'm seeing is that there are students in the room, right, who are thinking about these issues. And I really, the thing that gives me hope, and for a while earlier in my work, I was a really dark thought about everything that was happening, but the thing that gives me hope is that there are these incredible students who I believe are going to take these ideas, these little offerings in the book or the resource triads or whatever, and just extend them in ways that I cannot imagine to come up with new solutions. And so I have a new book that I'm thinking through, and it was actually inspired by Paula and our conversation leading up to this, where she said something about fangirls, and the book is going to be called something like Environmental Fangirls. The idea that there is this cohort of people who individually and collectively have the ability to transform in a generation the human relationship with nature. And I genuinely believe it's not only happened, it is happening. And it is so exciting because I think where we are in this weird, specific, historic moment with animals is going to be completely revolutionized in the next 20 and 40 years. And I think people in this room are going to do it.
Thank you, Karen. Well, I think I speak for the whole room when I say I'm deeply inspired by everything you've shared with us today. Thank you so much, not only for the messages and the content of your work that you've shared with us, but in your mode of delivery. Your expression has been so grounded, creative, and inspiring for all of us. It's been the perfect way for us to end the first day of our conference here. Thank you so much, Karen. A round of applause.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Karen. I will leave you to enjoy the rest of your day while we take care of some of our end-of-day housekeeping here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye. All right, everyone. We've made it to the end. Michelle, I believe, has a couple couple of housekeeping notes for us. What time are we at? So we have a drinks reception ready for us, hopefully, outside, which will last until about 6:30. You're welcome to stay for as long as you like. At that point, I will take a group who wish to walk to dinner tonight from the entrance of campus at 6:30 sharp. I'll show you the way. Otherwise, you're welcome to ask us or some of our student volunteers about how you can find a taxi or another mode of transport to the venue. It's not too far. It's about a 20-25-minute walk or shorter by car. Do I have anything else I need to share? No. If anyone would like to join us for dinner but doesn't yet have a ticket, as I mentioned earlier, we have a few spaces left, so do come and speak to me after this. And yes, Michelle, over to you.
Actually, just very briefly, on the topic of collaboration, we're joined here with two fantastic lawyers from Ireland, Demi Mallon and Reggie Gaffey, and I've been working on some issues with Ireland as well. There's a whole lot of cross-border issues that are happening as well. If you're a lawyer, if you're a student, and you're at all interested in this topic, we deal with things from puppy farms to agriculture, but predominantly puppy farms at the moment. Please come and grab one of us. We'd really like to hear from you. And we'd be delighted to have people volunteer to work with us. So that's my thing.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. All right, let's break. We'll look